who is Mystery Babylon, or Babylon the Great, in the book of Revelation? We know that ultimately it has to do with a city that reigns over the kings of the earth. And yet there has been so much speculation and debate on just what city is being pictured here in the book of Revelation, and it had seemed like such a complex subject. And yet, what I want to show you in this video is how simple the answer really is. But there is a mystery to it. That's why it's called Mystery Babylon the Great. Now, what I want to accomplish in this video is at least give you the answer up front as quickly as I can, so that you can see the dynamics of what is going on throughout this Revelation and really throughout the whole Bible, because this story spans the book. It is not a new story. It is not a different story. It is the same story, as we are about to see. So if you know what the puzzle should look like and what the answer is, at least from my view, and you can make up your own mind, then you know why we're looking at certain proofs and saying the things we're saying, because depending on how long this takes, it might have to be broken up into shorter videos. I'm not sure. This is my first time running through this. When I taught it on our Saturday night Bible study groups, we spent 3 hours easily. So I'm trying to put as much as I can in it without taking up a lot of time. So here in Revelation 17, let's just kind of set up so we can understand the answer. And we have this woman and the angels that come to John. Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. So that's what really this chapter is ultimately about. It's about the judgment of this great harlot, which is a city that reigns over the kings of the earth. So remember that. It's all about the judgment of a certain city. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with this woman and been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Fornication and immorality in this sense has to do with not the actual act or sexual immorality, but it has to do with the spiritual fornication or unfaithfulness to God and his truth. So we're looking at not just some outward sin of the flesh, but we're looking at a spiritual concept of false worship, of worshiping something that is not identified by God as part of the truth. So that'll become clear as we get into this. So he carried me away in the spirit, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of names of blasphemy. And this beast had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. So this has to do with false worship, or worship that is not part of the truth. Jesus said those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So this is just the opposite of that. On her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Now that's an ancient way of saying this is like the worst. This is the biggest. And so not that she actually mothered or they proceeded forth from her as children from a mother, but that, like we would say, it's the mother of all battles, the biggest, the most prominent, the worst. So she, in verse 6, is depicted as being drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when he saw her, he marveled with great amazement. But the angel in verse 7 said, Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. So we're going to get the answer here in this chapter. It won't be necessarily apparent to you until I explain what's going on, and then you're going to sit back and say, yeah, that was so obvious. How did we not see this? So We know from a previous study that we did about Gog and Magog and the Antichrist that this beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns, the 7 heads have to do with 7 previous kingdoms. Now, we know and identified them because they were all had something to do with this woman and this city. So right there, if you're starting to think of Israel and the city of Jerusalem, you're on the right track, because each of these 7 kingdoms occupied, invaded, and conquered or troubled in some way this city. So we have Egypt, and we have, after that, the Assyrian Empire, and then after that, the Babylonian Empire, then the Persian Empire. After that, the 5th was the Greek Empire. The 6th was the Roman Empire that was present in John's time. And then the 7th, as of John's time, had not yet come, but he was told that this 7th would come. And we now know that it was the Turkish Empire. And this Turkish Empire was the 7th, and then the mystery there was that this empire would come, but then it would go, but then it would be revived at the very end for a very short time. And so even though it was the 8th in a sense, it was still counted or considered in the prophetic word as part of the 7th, kind of like the 7th coming back, but with a slight difference. So that's the empires, that's the heads, the mountains or heads of this beast, the 7. That's why there's only 7 and not 8, because of the fact that this 8th is really kind of part of the 7. Now, the 10 kings or 10 horns, as we go on in this chapter, we were told that they are 10 kings who live concurrently with the beast or the Antichrist. But now we're looking at the man himself, who is demonically influenced by Satan. Satan gives him his power, authority. His coming is after the energy or working of Satan himself. And so the 10 kings are all living at the same time in the Middle Eastern area where all these empires occupied or flourished. So it's a Middle Eastern thing. It's not Europe, it's not North America, it's not South. That's what the revelation here is. And these 10 kings come from that same area of the world. And they give their power and allegiance to the Antichrist here at the very end. Once he invades the nation of Israel, his prophetic career is very short. It only lasts 3.5 years after this invasion has begun. Now, the point of chapter 17 is how it ends is that these 10 kings give their power and authority to this man, the Antichrist, and God puts it in their hearts to hate the harlot. So let me read this part because this is so significant. The 10 horns, this is verse 16, which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot. They will make her desolate and naked and eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Now, as we read on, we know that this is a city. So when you read all of these terms, make her desolate, naked, eat her flesh, burn her with fire, that's an ancient idiom or a way of saying that they will invade a city and do much damage to it, overwhelm it, conquer it. Verse 17, for God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And now here's the clincher, here's the answer. Verse 18, the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So the question, what is this great city? Are we talking about a rebuilt Babylon? Are we talking about New York City? Are we talking about some other city in the world? Are we talking about Mecca? Are we talking about, Rome? Or are we talking about Jerusalem? Now, as strange as this may seem, even though you can make a case for some of these cities in part, but yet really step back and look at the whole story of the Bible, with these 7 kingdoms. And what do we see? What is the story that the prophets foretold over and over again? What has been the continuing conflict here in the world with the city of peace, and yet a city that's known nothing pretty much but war? Is this not the continuing story that the prophets foretold, that Israel, God's people, called to be a light to the world, to the nations, and they went after these other gods and they forfeited, they did not perform, they did not accomplish their role. They didn't fulfill their call, I should say, to be a light to the nations. Instead, they pursued a false way of establishing their own righteousness, climbing the stairway to heaven on our own, instead of trusting in God's grace and what was coming. And so they went after all of these gods, and every time they did, God would raise up another nation, the weapons of his indignation, such as with Babylon, to chasten them, to come against them, to invade Israel, conquer Israel, sometimes carrying them away into captivity until they repented, and then he would have mercy on them and bring them back, and then they would repeat the same cycle over and over again. This has been the story, right? And so I like to say, here's the tale of 3 cities, but they're all, in a sense, connected, because in the one sense, we have a city. As Abraham looked for a city, right? He considered himself a pilgrim in this world because he was looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. He was not looking for a city here on the earth. He was looking for a heavenly city, a heavenly Jerusalem. And so that is pictured here in the book of Revelation. So there's one aspect of Jerusalem in a spiritual sense of a heavenly city, and we're going to look at that in a moment. But then there was also another city, which was the natural Jerusalem here on the earth. It was a city that could be described only as Babylon, Sodom, Egypt. In other words, here's what we have in the book of Revelation just a few chapters earlier, when it's talking about the 2 witnesses and how Jerusalem will be invaded and will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles for this final 3.5 years of the Antichrist. And it says that when the Antichrist kills these 2 witnesses, their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. Now, that term is going to appear over and over again throughout the book of Revelation. And it's going to be used for all 3 aspects of this city. I'm giving you the first one was there is a heavenly city whose builder and maker is God. And then there's another city that knows nothing but destruction and ruin and has failed in its calling, its purpose to be a light to the world. And so in this sense, it's referring to the harlot. That's the harlot. It is Jerusalem when it is in its apostate form, when it has rejected truth, when it has rejected the Messiah, when it has gone after other gods, when it has failed its purpose in the plan of God. So here, their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually is called Sodom and spiritually called Egypt. And then it clarifies where our Lord was crucified. Obviously, that's Jerusalem. He was not crucified in Egypt or Sodom, but spiritually, we're given a clue here to help us understand what's going on here. This city, this great city, when it's in its apostate form, when it's in its failed form, where it has run away from the call of God and has not fulfilled it in a spiritual sense. It can be identified with all of these other cities that represent sin and so forth. So it's called, in a sense, Sodom. It's called, in a sense, Egypt. It could be called, in another sense, as we see later, Babylon, the mother of harlots. So that's what's going on here. We're seeing the same story painted by the prophets of old, who predicted that Israel would fall away again. They missed the time of their visitation. That's this modern day story going back into the last 2,000 years. They missed the time of their visitation. They crucified their Messiah, and therefore they were led away captive into all of the nations, and their city was destroyed. Their temple was destroyed. Not one stone was left standing on another. God judged that city, Jerusalem, and He's going to do it again because of the same reasons. And so that's the story here. And the prophets foretold that whenever Israel would fall away, that God would bring the nations against them. But there's a hope. There's an end to the story, because we know that in our time here, where we see Jerusalem right now, again, in its apostate form, they have not come back to the Messiah. They are not unlike the Muslims. In fact, they both, I guess I'll take this. This is probably the best place to introduce this. They both satisfy the definition of Antichrist. Did you know that? I mean, we as Christians have been programmed to look at Israel as the apple of God's eye. And they were. You say, were? Are you saying it's over for them? No. We know from the book of Romans that their blindness right now is temporary. It's been 2,000 years, but it's temporary. It's not going to last. In other words, there is an end to that story that is glorious, and that is that a remnant will come back and be saved. And they will be saved, according to Hosea, as we come to the third day of the Messiah. Now, this revival is predicted, and once this revival takes place, this city that is invaded a final time by the Antichrist, by the seven-headed dragon with the 10 horns, the 10 kings. This is the story that the prophets predicted over and over again. It's in the book of Joel. It's in the book of Jeremiah. It's in the book of Daniel, how he would bring them against them at the end. And therefore, Revelation, the whole book, is just a retelling, a final summary of this ages long actually, story in which there would be 3 cities or 3 phases or aspects of a city called Jerusalem. The one, a heavenly Jerusalem; a second, an earthly Jerusalem that is identified with everything evil and ungodly and everything that is an abomination; and then a third, here's the other part, wherein once this Sodom, Egypt, Babylon city known as Jerusalem is destroyed, is burned, is destroyed and leveled, that God will deal with those armies, those people who came against Jerusalem, and He will actually raise up out of the ashes a new city. It will be exalted. There will be topographical changes in the land of Israel because of the earthquakes and so forth. And a new city will be rebuilt, a new temple. Probably the one that's in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 49. Those chapters describe a city that has never, or a temple that has never been built. But it would fit on the same area where Jerusalem is today, but once it's destroyed and leveled and then raised up and a new one built, then this new city, this new Jerusalem, it will be the prophetic fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 2, which speaks of Jerusalem in the last day, in the 1,000 years of Christ's reign over the earth. And it says that it will come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house, that's his temple, shall be established, or his temple will be established on the top of the mountains. So there will be an elevation. As we see in Isaiah chapter 40, every hill will be brought down, every valley will be exalted, smooth, straight, so forth. This will be where the new Jerusalem, not the heavenly one, but a new Jerusalem down here will be built, and a new temple, and it will fulfill the purposes that God called them to fulfill from the very beginning. They will finally fulfill it, because if you've been following these videos, as you know in Daniel 7, once the Lord comes and takes us to the Father's house and seats us as the heavenly court, we will execute the written judgments against this beast and the 10 kings and the other nations that come against and end up fighting in this war. And then we will give the kingdom under heaven. We're reigning from up there, but we will give the kingdom under heaven to the Jewish people, the saints of the Most High, to the people of God. So they will have a chance during this 1,000 years when we're still up there and they're down here, and there's another Jerusalem built. And it says that it will be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. So this is what they were designed and supposed to be at the beginning. And many people will come and say, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. What for? He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. See, these are the nations that survive and go on to generate offspring and so forth after this war. The great supper of God is over, and this 3.5 year war that begins with Gog, or the Antichrist, invading Israel with his 10 kings, his coalition of nations. God turns out the lights. He comes down. He splits the mountain, because as you read, it says that God says to his people concerning Babylon, come out of her, my people. And so God, through Jesus, splits the Mount of Olives to prepare a way where they can flee, the remnant in Israel. They escape so that they can fulfill what he says, come out of her, my people. See, his people are not in some of these other cities that people propose, but they are in Jerusalem. So when Jerusalem is invaded, when the 10 kings fulfill God's purpose, which is to invade the city and to bring the Jerusalem that is ungodly, that is full of abominations, to its knees and destroy it, so that a new one can be raised up in its place, so that the remnant can have their eyes opened to, and the blindness removed, so that they can look upon the one whom they pierced when they see him come for his church, his bride. And they look and they see him and they mourn for him and they repent and they become saved. They believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and he pours out his Spirit on them. And even though this Babylon will fall and never rise again, it will never rise again in that state. It will never again be a Sodom, Egypt, or Babylon. You get the idea? He's not saying that Jerusalem in another form won't be built in its place, because it will. It's the same thing we see in Ezekiel 39 when it says that God, after this war is over and after they repent, when he rends the heavens, they rend their hearts and they believe, they turn to him, the remnant, that then from then on, they will never profane his holy name ever again. That's the same thought. Jerusalem as Sodom, Egypt, and Babylon will never be found anymore. They will never transgress again. They will never fall away again. That's the good news. That's the future and the hope that Jeremiah said, I have a good future for you. I have a hope. I know what my plans are, and it's good. But, it will be a remnant that happens to. So Jerusalem will fulfill this, for out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge between the nations. So here we have three aspects of a city called Jerusalem. We have a heavenly Jerusalem, and we have an earthly one that knew nothing but failure, that is considered an abomination, so much so that you would call it a harlot, because instead of being a light to the world and leading the nations to where they should be, she did just the opposite. She made them drunk. She stupefied them. She brought them into a place of spirituality that was not good, that was evil. In fact, and then we have the third city, which is the rebuilt Jerusalem that will fulfill its purpose during the millennial reign of Christ. So what am I saying here? On the Temple Mount right now, in the near future, there will be two buildings. One's already there. It's called the Dome of the Rock, the Shrine of Omar, whatever. And inside the Golden Dome is an inscription that says, God forbid that he should have a son. And then there'll be another temple that will be a building that will be built, and it will be the temple, the Jewish temple. The problem is it's not going to be any different than that temple, because they don't believe that God has a son either. Now the problem is, when you look at the definition of Antichrist, John gave it to us in 1 John chapter 2, verses 22 through 23. Who is a liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? So anyone who denies that Jesus is the Christ, number one, you're a liar. He is Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. Now there's the definition of Antichrist. Yeah, it will be consummated in a man that allows the devil to empower him. But anyone who denies that God is the Father of Jesus Christ, that he came in the flesh, that's the spirit of Antichrist. And John pointed out that there were those who were among them at the beginning, but then left because they were of that spirit. They were Jews that just didn't believe. They didn't follow through with it. So that establishes the fact that a Jewish person, in spite of the Old Testament prophets and their desire, which can be very sincere and so forth, to try to connect with Yahweh or Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But here's the deal, and here's the clincher. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father either. He who acknowledges the Son has the Father also. So this is the little dirty secret, I guess, about the Antichrist and the spirit of Antichrist that the world doesn't want to look at, including many Christians, because they still want to look at Israel as the apple of God's eye. And yet, what about the church? What about the new covenant? Is that worthless? What? Why are they the chosen people? Or why are they the elect and not the church? You see, in the New Testament, the elect are the church. Now, we're not saying that they don't deserve respect and so forth. We do. We respect them and we hold them in honor as a nation, as a people, because of their forefathers, because they were the ones that brought us the prophets and ultimately much of this book. And so we respect that. But yet, nevertheless, the truth is there that if you deny the Son, if you deny that Jesus is the Son of God, then you not only don't have the Son, you don't have the Father either. You have no connection with Yahweh or Jehovah. You're fooling yourself. And the reason is because of Hebrews chapter 10, 29. And that's why the Bible, the book of Revelation, paints such a drastic picture of this city and names it by these very extreme names. A harlot, the mother of harlots, Sodom, Egypt, Babylon, all of these names that conjure up the worst of what you can think of. And it's trying to make a point. It's an exaggeration to emphasize the fact of what Hebrews 10:29 tells us, which is that Jesus came because it came time that God didn't want any sacrifices. He didn't need sacrifices and offerings, the blood of bulls and goats that can never take away sin. Because his Son had said, I will come and do it. Give me a body, I'll do it. And so he came and he offered himself as the one perfect, once and for all sacrifice. And once you have that, you don't need any others. And so here Hebrews 10:29 says, of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy of, who has, get these three things, who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant by which sanctification has been offered to us as a common or an unholy thing, and who has insulted the Spirit of grace. So there's three things there. That you are if you deny the Son and you think you have the Father, you don't. Because you have trampled the Son of God underfoot. You are counting the blood of the covenant. Why would you rebuild a temple to go back to the blood of bulls and goats when you can have the blood of the Lamb? That's the issue. That is the issue. That's why any city that raises up two temples or buildings on its Temple Mount to honor God, and one says, God forbid that he should have a son. That's ridiculous. And the other says the same thing. Yeah, I agree. Well, let's go back and try to be right with God with the blood of bulls and goats. And try reading Isaiah 66. We'll get into that maybe in another lesson. Here's what God thinks of rebuilding a temple. So this is why, because it is the spirit of Antichrist. And you think you have the Father. I like to say it like this, even in America, we're so adamant that we must have on our currency, in God we trust. I'm like, wait a minute. It should be in Jesus Christ we trust. That's why we're in so much trouble, because we haven't preached Christ. You believe there's one God? Well, fine, that's great, that's good. So does the devil, and they tremble over it. But I want you to know there's only one name given among men under heaven whereby we must be saved. And it's not just God. It has to be his Son. And that's the message of this whole book. And it consummates in the book of Revelation when he shows us three aspects of a city called Jerusalem. One is a heavenly city that will one day come down and cap the world. The other is a city that is only known for its abominations and harlotry and unfaithfulness to God, which will be destroyed here shortly. And the other is a rebuilt city in its place, elevated on top of the mountains, where the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob get a chance to really finally fulfill their call. So that's the answer. That's the continuing story throughout the book of Revelation. And as evidence, I'll give you this. There are this many instances where if you just look up the word city, you can just take a concordance, that's what I did, and look up the word city in the book of Revelation, and you'll find that 12 times the word city refers to this harlot city, that's Sodom, Egypt, and so forth. 12 times. 13 times in the same book of Revelation, the word city refers to this heavenly city. the New Jerusalem. And then one time it refers to the rebuilt Jerusalem during this 1,000-year reign of Christ after the great supper of God has happened and the world goes on to rebuild. So this is really a book about the tale of these three aspects of the city named Jerusalem. That's why it's not about anything else. It's just a continuation of what all the prophets have said. And if you don't believe me, I'll end with this. This is Revelation chapter 21. It's in contrast to the city that's called a harlot and full of abominations. And here, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls filled with the seven last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, "Come, and I will show you the bride." Whose bride? The Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the great city. There's that term again. But it depends on which aspect you're looking at. Here, it's the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, and so forth. And then it tells us that later on in verse 24, the nations of those who are saved shall walk in its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory and honor into it. Verse 27, but there shall by no means enter anything that defiles or causes an abomination or a lie, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. So what is the bottom line here? First of all, the book of Revelation is showing us the contrast between three great cities. First, we have the great city of the harlot, drunk with the blood of the saints, destined for its ultimate destruction. And then a city exalted above the hills, to which all nations will flow, that they may be taught God's ways. And then finally, a great city built for the bride, the Lamb's wife, that reigns from above during the time that we're waiting for a new heavens and a new earth. And this heavenly city actually comes down and merges with the earth, which is the consummation of God's plan.